Chapter 6. The Costs of Circulation. Section 1. Pure Circulation Costs. Subsection A. Buying and Selling Time. Capital's changes of form from commodity into money and from money into commodity are at the same time business transactions for the capitalist, acts of buying and selling. The time which these changes of form take for their completion exists subjectively from the standpoint of the capitalist as selling time and buying time, the time during which he functions as seller and buyer on the market. Just as the circulation time of capital forms a necessary part of its reproduction time, so the time during which the capitalist buys and sells, prowls around the market, forms a necessary part of the time in which he functions as a capitalist, i.e. as personified capital. It forms a part of his business hours. Since it was assumed that commodities are bought and sold at their value, all that is involved in these acts is the conversion of the same value from one form into another, from the commodity form into the money form, and from the money form into the commodity form, a change of state. If the commodities are sold at their values, then the amounts of value in the hands of both buyer and seller remain unchanged. It is only the form of existence that is altered. If the commodities are not sold at their values, then the sum of converted values remains unaffected. What is a plus for one side is a minus for the other. But the metamorphoses C to M and M to C are business transactions between buyer and seller. They need time to come to terms, the more so insofar as a struggle is involved here, in which each side seeks to get the better of the other. It is businessmen who face each other here, and when Greek meets Greek, then comes the tug of war. The change of state costs time and labor power, not to create value, but rather to bring about the conversion of the value from one form into the other, and so the reciprocal attempt to use this opportunity to appropriate an excess quantity of value does not change anything. This labor, increased by evil intent on either side, no more creates value than the labor that takes place in legal proceedings increases the value of the object in dispute. This labor, which is a necessary moment of the capitalist production process in its totality and also includes circulation or is included by it, behaves somewhat like the work of combustion involved in setting light to a material that is used to produce heat. This work does not itself produce any heat, although it is a necessary moment of the combustion process. For example, in order to use coal as a fuel, I must combine it with oxygen, and for this purpose transform it from the solid into the gaseous state, i.e. effect a change in its physical form of existence, or physical state. The separation of the carbon molecules that were combined into a solid whole, and the breaking down of the carbon molecule itself into its individual atoms, must precede the new combination, and this costs a certain expenditure of energy which is not transformed into heat, but rather detracts from the heat. When the commodity owners are not capitalists, but rather independent direct producers, the time they spend on buying and selling is a deduction from their labor time, and they therefore always seek, in antiquity as also in the Middle Ages, to defer such operations to feast days. The dimensions assumed by the conversion of commodities in the hands of capitalists can naturally not transform this labor, which does not create value, but only mediates a change in the form of value into value-creating labor. Just as little can such a miracle of transubstantiation proceed by a transposition, i.e. if the industrial capitalists, instead of themselves performing the work of combustion, make this into the exclusive business of third parties paid by them. These third parties will certainly not put their labor power at the disposal of the capitalists for the sake of their blue eyes. It is similarly immaterial for the rent collector of a landlord or the porter at a bank that their labor does not add one iota to the magnitude of the value of the rent, nor to the gold pieces carried to another bank by the sackful. For the capitalist who has others to work for him, buying and selling is a major function. Since he appropriates the product of many people on a larger social scale, so he has also to sell on such a scale, and later to transform money back again into the elements of production. Now, as before, the time taken up with buying and selling creates no value. An illusion is introduced here by the function of merchant's capital, but without going into further detail, this much is clear from the start. If we have a function which, although in and for itself unproductive, is nevertheless a necessary moment of reproduction, then when this is transformed through the division of labor from the secondary activity of many into the exclusive activity of a few, into their special business, this does not change the character of the function itself. One merchant, considered here merely as the agent of the formal transformation of commodities as mere buyer and seller, may, by way of his operations, shorten the buying and selling time for many producers. He should then be considered as a machine that reduces the expenditure of useless energy, or helps to set free production time. In order to simplify the matter, since we shall only be considering the merchant as capitalist and merchant's capital later on, Let us assume that this buying and selling agent is a man who sells his labor. He expends his labor power and his labor time in the operations C to M and M to C, and hence he lives off this in the same way as someone else might live from spinning or making pills. He performs a necessary function because the reproduction process itself includes unproductive functions. He works as well as the next man, but the content of his labor creates neither value nor products. He is himself part of the faux frais of production. His usefulness does not lie in his transforming an unproductive function into a productive one, or unproductive labor into productive. It would be a miracle if a transformation of this kind could be brought about by such a transference of functions. He is useful rather because a smaller part of society's labor power and labor time is now tied up in these unproductive functions. Still more, let us assume that he is simply a wage laborer, even if one of the better paid. Whatever his payment, as a wage laborer he works part of the day for nothing. He may receive every day the value product of 8 hours labor and function for 10. The 2 hours surplus labor that he performs no more produce value than do his 8 hours of necessary labor, although it is by means of the latter that a part of the social product is transferred to him. In the first place, both before and after, from the social point of view, a person's labor power is used up for 10 hours in this mere circulation function. It is not available for anything else, including productive labor. Secondly, however, society does not count these 2 hours of surplus labor, although they are spent by the individual who performs them. Society does not appropriate by these means any additional product or value, but the costs of circulation that he represents are reduced by a fifth, from 10 hours to 8. Society pays no equivalent for a fifth of this active circulation time whose agent he is. If it is the capitalist who employs these agents, then the circulation costs of his capital, which form a deduction from his receipts, are reduced by the non-payment of the 2 hours. For him, this is a positive profit, because the negative restriction on the valorization of his capital is reduced. As long as small, independent commodity producers spend a part of their own time in buying and selling, this simply presents itself as time spent in the intervals between their productive function, or as a loss in their production time. In all circumstances, the time taken here is a cost of circulation, which does not add anything to the values converted. It is a necessary cost for transferring these from the commodity form into the money form. Insofar as the capitalist commodity producer appears as the agent of circulation, he is distinguished from the direct commodity producer only in that he sells and buys on a larger scale, and hence functions as circulation agent to a higher degree. But if the scale of his business forces or enables him to buy, or hire, his own circulation agents as wage laborers, this does not affect the substance of the phenomenon. Labor power and labor time must be spent to a certain degree in the circulation process, insofar as this is a mere change of form. But this now appears as an additional outlay of capital. A part of the variable capital must be deployed in acquiring these labor powers that function only in circulation. This capital advance creates neither products nor value. It proportionally reduces the scale on which the capital advance functions productively. It is the same as if a part of the product was transformed into a machine that bought and sold the remaining part of the product. This machine means a deduction from the product. It is not involved in the production process, although it can reduce the labor power, etc. spent on circulation. It simply forms a part of these circulation costs. Subsection B. Bookkeeping. Besides the actual buying and selling, labor time is spent on bookkeeping, which requires pens, ink, paper, desks, and other office equipment as well as objectified labor. Thus it is spent in this function both as labor power and as means of labor. In this connection, the same state of affairs obtains as with buying and selling time. As a unity within its circuits, as value in process, whether within the production sphere or the two faces of the circulation sphere, it is only ideally that capital exists in the shape of money of account, at first in the head of the commodity producer, capitalist or otherwise. By way of bookkeeping, which also includes the determination or reckoning of commodity prices, price calculation, the movement of capital is registered and controlled. The movement of production, and particularly of valorization, in which commodities figure only as bearers of value, as the names of things whose ideal value existence is set down in money of account, thus receives a symbolic reflection in the imagination. As long as the individual commodity producer either keeps his accounts merely in his head, as the peasant does, for example, only capitalist agriculture produces the bookkeeping farmer, or only keeps account of his expenses, receipts, dates of payment, etc., incidentally, outside his production time, it is obvious that this function of his, and the instruments of labor which he may use to perform it, such as paper, etc., represent an additional expenditure of labor time and instruments of labor, which, although necessary, constitutes a deduction both from the time that he can spend productively and from the instruments of labor that function in the actual production process, and enter into the formation of products and value. The nature of the function itself is in no way changed by the scale that it assumes by being concentrated in the hands of the capitalist commodity producer, and by appearing, not as the function of many small commodity producers, but as that of one capitalist, as one function within a large-scale production process, nor is it changed by being torn loose from the productive functions to which it is an adjunct and becoming the independent function of special agents who are exclusively entrusted with it. The division of labor, with one function becoming independent in this way, does not make this into a product or value-forming function if it is not so in itself, and thus was already so before it became independent. If a capitalist invests his capital for the first time, then he must invest one part in acquiring a bookkeeper, etc., and a means of bookkeeping. If his capital is already functioning in its continuous reproduction process, then he must constantly transform a part of the commodity product by way of money into a bookkeeper, clerks, and so on. This part of the capital is withdrawn from the production process and belongs to the costs of circulation as a deduction from the total yield, including the actual labor power which is exclusively devoted to this function. There is nevertheless a certain distinction between the costs arising from bookkeeping or unproductive expenditure of labor time on the one hand, and those of mere buying and selling time on the other. The latter simply arise from the particular social form of the production process, from the fact that it is a process of production of commodities. Bookkeeping, however, as the supervision and ideal recapitulation of the process, becomes ever more necessary the more the process takes place on a social scale and loses its purely individual character. It is thus more necessary in capitalist production than in the fragmented production of handicraftsmen and peasants, more necessary in communal production than in capitalist. The costs of bookkeeping are however reduced with the concentration of production and in proportion to its increasing transformation into social bookkeeping. We are concerned here simply with the general character of those circulation costs that arise from the merely formal metamorphosis. It would be superfluous to go into all their detailed forms. But how forms pertaining to the merely formal transformation of value, thus arising from the specific social form of the production process, forms which in the case of the individual commodity producer are only evanescent and scarcely noticeable moments that run alongside his production or are dovetailed in with it, how these may strike the eye as massive circulation costs is seen in the simple case of the receipt and dispensing of money, once this has become independent as an exclusive function of banks, etc., or of cashiers in individual businesses, and is concentrated on a large scale. What must be emphasized is that these circulation costs do not change their character with their altered form. Subsection C. Money. Whether a product is produced as a commodity or not, it is always a material form of wealth, a use value, destined for individual or productive consumption. As a commodity, its value exists only ideally in the price, which does not affect its actual use form. But the fact that certain commodities, such as gold and silver, function as money, and as such dwell exclusively in the circulation process, for they also remain in the circulation sphere as a hoard, reserve, etc., even if only latently, is purely a product of the particular social form of the production process, as a process of commodity production. Since, on the basis of capitalist production, the commodity is the general form of the product, the great mass of products are produced as commodities, and must hence assume the money form, and since the mass of commodities, the part of the social wealth functioning as commodities, is constantly growing, so the quantity of gold and silver that functions as means of circulation, means of payment, reserve, etc. also increases. The commodities that function as money go neither into individual nor into productive consumption. They represent social labor fixed in a form in which it serves merely as a machine for circulation. Apart from the fact that a part of the social wealth is confined to this unproductive form, the wear and tear of money requires its steady replacement, or the transformation of more social labor, in the product form, into more gold and silver. These replacement costs are significant in nations where there is a developed capitalism, because the part of the wealth that is confined to the form of money is considerable. Gold and silver, as the money commodities, constitute for society costs of circulation that arise simply from the social form of production. They are faux frais of commodity production in general, which grow with the development of this production and with capitalist production in particular. This is a part of the social wealth which has to be sacrificed to the circulation process. Section 2. Costs of storage. Those circulation costs that proceed from the mere change in form of value, from circulation in its ideal sense, do not enter into the value of commodities. The portions of capital spent on them constitute mere deductions from the capital productively spent, as far as the capitalist is concerned. The circulation costs that we shall deal with now are different in nature. They can arise from production processes that are simply continued in the circulation sphere, and whose productive character is thus merely hidden by the circulation form. There may also be nothing but costs from the social point of view, unproductive expenditure of labor, either living or objectified, but precisely because of this, they still have a value-forming effect for the individual capitalist, and form an addition to the selling price of his commodities. This follows from the simple fact that these costs differ between different individual capitals within the same production sphere. The act of adding them to the price of the commodity means that they become distributed in proportion to the degree to which they occur for the individual capitalist. But all labor that adds value can also add surplus value, and will always add surplus value on the basis of capitalism, since the value that it forms is dependent on its own extent, and the surplus value that it forms is dependent on the extent to which the capitalist pays for it. Thus, while the costs that make commodities dearer, without increasing their use value, are faux frais of production from the social point of view, for the individual capitalist they can constitute sources of enrichment. On the other hand, insofar as what they add to the price of the commodity merely distributes these circulation costs equally, they do not thereby cease to be unproductive in character. Insurance companies, for example, divide the losses of individual capitalists among the capitalist class, but this does not prevent the losses thus adjusted from being losses as before, from the standpoint of the total social capital. Subsection A. Stock formation in general. During its existence as commodity capital, or its stay on the market, i.e. as long as it finds itself in the interval between the production process from which it emerges and the consumption process which it enters into, the product forms a commodity stock. As a commodity on the market, and hence in the form of a stock, commodity capital figures twice in each circuit, once as the commodity product of the actual capital in process whose circuit is under consideration, the other time as the commodity product of another capital that must be present on the market in order to be sold and transformed into productive capital. It is possible, of course, that this latter commodity capital is produced only to order. There is then an interruption until it has been produced. The flow of the production and reproduction process, however, requires that a mass of commodities, means of production, is constantly present on the market, i.e. forms a stock. Productive capital similarly includes the purchase of labor power, and the money form is here only the value form of the means of subsistence that the worker must find for the greater part of the market. In the course of this subsection, we shall go into this in more detail. The point, however, is already established. Let us take up the standpoint of the capital value in process, which has been transformed into commodity product and must now be sold or transformed back into money, and which therefore functions for the time being as commodity capital on the market. The state in which it forms a stock is therefore an inexpedient and involuntary stay on the market. The more quickly it is sold, the more fluid the reproduction process. The delay in the formal transformation hinders the material change that must occur in the circuit of capital, and thus its further functioning as productive capital. On the other hand, the constant presence of commodities on the market, the commodity stock, appears for M to C as the condition for the flow of the reproduction process and for the investment of new or additional capital. The persistence of commodity capital as a commodity stock requires buildings, stores, containers, warehouses, i.e., an outlay of constant capital. It equally requires that payment be made for the labor power employed in placing the commodities in their containers. Furthermore, commodities decay and are subject to the damaging influence of the elements. Additional capital must thus be expended to protect them from this, partly in objective form as means of labor and partly in labor power. The existence of capital in its form as commodity capital, and hence as a commodity stock, gives rise to costs that, since they do not pertain to the production sphere, count as costs of circulation. These circulation costs are distinguished from those mentioned under heading 1, inasmuch as they do enter into the value of commodities to a certain extent and thus make the commodities dearer. Under all circumstances, capital and labor power which serve to maintain and store the commodity stock are withdrawn from the direct production process. On the other hand, the capital employed here, including labor power as a component of the capital, must be replaced out of the social product. Hence this outlay has the same effect as a reduction in the productivity of labor, so that a greater quantity of capital and labor is required to obtain a specific useful effect. These are simply expenses. Insofar as the costs of circulation made necessary by the formation of the commodity stock arise solely from the time taken to transform existing values from the commodity form into the money form, i.e., only from the specific social form of the production process, only from the fact that the product is produced as a commodity and must therefore also pass through a transformation into money, they share exactly the same character as the circulation costs enumerated under heading 1. On the other hand, however, the value of the commodities is conserved, or increased, only because the use value, the product itself, is transferred under certain objective conditions that cost an outlay of capital, and subjected to operations in which additional labor works on the use values. The calculation of the commodity values, the bookkeeping for this process, and the buying and selling, on the contrary, do not operate on the use values in which the commodity value exists. They are only concerned with its form. Thus, although in the case assumed here, these expenses of stock formation, which is here involuntary, arise purely from a delay in the change of form and from the necessity for this change, they are nevertheless distinguished from the expenses under heading 1 in that their actual object is not the formal transformation of value, but the conservation of the value which exists in the commodity as a product, a use value, and hence can be conserved only by conserving the product, the use value itself. The use value is not increased or raised. On the contrary, it declines. But its decline is restricted, and it itself is conserved. The value that is advanced and exists in the commodity is also not increased here. But new labor, both objectified and living, is added to it. We must now investigate how far these expenses proceed from the particular character of commodity production in general, and how far from commodity production in its universal absolute form, i.e. capitalist commodity production, how far too they are common to all social production and simply assume a particular shape, a specific form of appearance within capitalist production. Adam Smith put forward the incredible opinion that the formation of a stock is a phenomenon peculiar to capitalist production. Later economists, for example Laylor, stressed on the contrary that with the development of capitalist production, stock formation declines. Sismondi even regarded this as one of the negative features of capitalist production. In point of fact, stock exists in 3 forms: in the form of productive capital, in the form of the individual consumption fund, and in the form of the commodity stock or commodity capital. Stock declines relatively in the one form when it increases in the other, although its absolute size may grow simultaneously in all 3 forms. It is clear from the start that where production is oriented directly towards the satisfaction of the producer's own requirements, and only a small portion of goods are produced for exchange or sale, i.e., where the social product does not assume the commodity form, or does so only to a small extent, the stock in the form of commodity, the commodity stock, forms only a small and evanescent part of wealth. Here, however, the consumption fund, i.e. the fund of means of subsistence, is relatively large. One has only to consider the peasant economy of antiquity. Here, an overwhelming part of the product was transformed directly, without forming a commodity stock, into a stock of means of production or means of subsistence, precisely because it remained in the hands of its possessor. Because it did not assume the form of a commodity stock, Adam Smith held that no stock existed in societies based on this mode of production. Adam Smith thus confused the form of stock with the stock itself, and believed that society previously lived from hand to mouth, abandoning itself to the hazards of the next day. This is a childish misunderstanding. Stock in the form of productive capital exists as means of production that are already engaged in the production process, or at least in the hands of the producer, i.e., latently already in the production process. We have seen above that as the productivity of labor develops, and thus with the development of the capitalist mode of production, which develops the social productivity of labor more than all previous modes of production, the mass of means of production that are incorporated once and for all in the process in the form of means of labor, and function repeatedly in it over a longer or shorter period, buildings, machines, etc., constantly grows, and that its growth is both premise and effect of the development of the social productive power of labor. The growth of wealth in this form, which is not only absolute but also relative, see Volume 1, Chapter 25, Section 2, is particularly characteristic of the capitalist mode of production. The material forms of existence of the constant capital, however, the means of production, do not consist only of such means of labor, but also of material for labor at the most varied stages of elaboration, as well as ancillary materials. As the scale of production grows, and the productive power of labor grows through cooperation, division of labor, machinery, etc., so does the mass of raw material, ancillaries, etc., that go into the daily reproduction process. These elements must be ready to hand at the place of production. The extent of this stock in the form of productive capital thus grows absolutely. In order for the process to keep flowing, quite apart from whether this stock can be renewed daily or only at definite intervals, there must always be a greater store of raw material, etc. at the place of production than is used up daily or weekly, for example. The continuity of the process requires that the existence of its preconditions should depend neither on the possible interruption of daily purchases, nor on whether the commodity product is sold daily or weekly, and can therefore only irregularly be transformed back into its elements of production. But it is clear that the degree to which productive capital is latent, or forms a stock, can differ very greatly. It makes a great difference, for example, whether the mill owner has to have sufficient cotton or coal on hand for 3 months or only for 1. We can see that this stock can decrease relatively even though it increases in absolute terms. This depends on various conditions which essentially all derive from the greater speed, regularity, and certainty with which the necessary mass of raw material can be constantly supplied in such a way that no interruption arises. The less these conditions are fulfilled, and the less therefore the certainty, regularity, and speed of the supply, the greater must be the latent part of the productive capital, i.e. the stock of raw materials, etc., in the hands of the producer and still waiting to be worked up. These conditions stand in inverse proportion to the level of development of capitalist production, and thus of the productive power of social labor, and so too, therefore, does the stock in this form. But what appears here as a decline in the stock, for example with Laylor, is in part only a decline of stock in the form of commodity capital or of commodity stock proper, i.e. a mere change of form of the same stock. For example, if a great mass of coal is produced every day in the country in question, i.e. if the scale and intensity of coal production is large, then the mill owner does not need a great store of coal in order to secure the continuity of his production. The constant and certain renewal of the coal supply makes this superfluous. Secondly, the speed with which the product of one process can be transferred to another process as means of production depends on the development of the means of transport and communication. The cheapness of transport plays a great role in this connection. The constantly repeated transportation of coal, for example, from the mine to the spinning mill will be dearer than the storage of a larger amount of coal for a longer period, if transport is relatively cheap. The two circumstances considered here proceed from the production process itself. The less dependent the mill owner is for the renewal of his stocks of cotton, coal, etc. on the direct sale of his yarn, and the more developed the credit system, the smaller this direct dependence. The smaller the relative size of these stocks need to be in order to secure a continuous production of yarn independent of the accidents of its sale. Fourthly, however, many raw materials, semi-finished goods, etc. require lengthy periods of time for their production, and this holds in particular for all raw materials provided by agriculture. If there is to be no interruption of the production process, then a definite stock of these must be present for the whole period of time in which new products cannot replace old. If this stock in the hands of the industrial capitalist declines, this only means that it increases in the form of a commodity stock in the hands of the merchant. The development of the means of transport, for example, permits cotton lying in the import docks to be quickly delivered from Liverpool to Manchester, so that the manufacturer can renew his stocks of cotton in relatively small portions according to his needs. But then the same cotton exists in even greater amounts as commodity stock in the hands of the Liverpool merchants. There is thus simply a change in form of the stock, which Laylor and others have overlooked. If we consider the social capital, there is the same quantity of products as before in the form of stock. For an individual country, the scale in which the quantity needed for the year, for example, must be held ready, declines with the development of the means of transport. If there are many steamships and sailing ships plying between America and Britain, then the opportunities for Britain to renew its cotton stock are increased, and thus the average volume of the cotton stock that Britain must keep in store declines. The development of the world market and the consequent multiplication of sources of supply for the same article has the same effect. The article is supplied bit by bit from different countries and at different points in time. Subsection B. The commodity stock proper. We have already seen how, on the basis of capitalist production, the commodity becomes the general form of the product, and the more so, the more this production develops in scale and depth. Thus, a far greater part of the product exists as a commodity, even at the same scale of production in comparison either with earlier modes of production or with the capitalist mode of production itself at a less developed stage. But every commodity, and thus also every commodity capital, which is simply a commodity, even if a commodity has the form of existence of capital value, insofar as it does not directly pass from the sphere of production into productive or individual consumption and finds itself on the market during the interval, forms an element of the commodity stock. In and for itself, assuming the scale of production is constant, the commodity stock therefore grows with capitalist production. We have already seen that this is only a change of form for the stock, i.e. that the stock increases in commodity form because it decreases in the form of direct production or consumption stock. There is simply a changed social form with the stock. If at the time there is an increase not only in the relative size of the commodity stock in relation to the total social product, but also in its absolute size, this is because the volume of the total product increases with capitalist production. As capitalist production develops, the scale of production is determined to an ever lesser degree by the immediate demand for the product, and to an ever greater degree by the scale of the capital which the individual capitalist has at his disposal, by his capital's drive for valorization and the need of his production process for continuity and extension. The mass of products from every particular branch of production that are on the market as commodities, or seek an outlet, necessarily grows together with this. The mass of capital tied up for a shorter or longer time in the form of commodity capital grows, and hence the commodity stock grows as well. Ultimately, most members of the society are transformed into wage laborers, people who live from hand to mouth, who receive their wages by the week and spend them by the day, and must thus find their means of subsistence available as a stock. However rapidly the particular elements of this stock may flow, a part of them must always stand still in order for the stock to remain in motion. All these moments arise out of the form of production, and the changes of form which are included in it, and which the product must pass through in the circulation process. Whatever the social form of the stock of products, its storage involves costs, buildings, containers, etc., which form receptacles for the product, similarly means of production and labor, more or less according to the nature of the product, which must be spent to ward off damaging influences. The more these stocks are socially concentrated, the smaller, relatively speaking, are the costs. These outlays always form part of social labor, whether in objectified or living form. Thus, in the capitalist form, they are outlays of capital, which do not go towards the formation of the product itself, and are thus deductions from it. They are necessary expenditures of social wealth, for they are the costs of conserving the social product, whether its existence as an element of the commodity stock arises merely from the social form of production, i.e., from the commodity form and its necessary transformations, or whether we consider the commodity stock simply as a special form of the stock of products common to all societies, even if not in the form of a commodity stock, this particular form of stock pertaining to the circulation process. The question now arises as to what extent these expenses enter into the value of commodities. If the capitalist has transformed the capital he advanced in means of production and labor power into products, into a certain mass of commodities ready for sale, and these remain in the store unsold, then it is not only the valorization process of his capital that is held up during this time. The expenditures that the conservation of this stock requires in buildings, additional labor, etc., form a positive loss. The eventual purchaser would laugh at the capitalist if he said, "I could not sell my commodity for 6 months, and it not only cost me so and so much in idle capital to maintain it for these 6 months, but also caused expense X. So much the worse for you, the buyer would say, for next to you there is another seller whose commodity was finished only yesterday. Your commodity is evidently a white elephant, and probably more or less damaged by the ravages of time. You must therefore sell cheaper than your rival." Whether the commodity producer is the real producer of his commodity, or its capitalist producer, and therefore merely the representative of the real producer, in no way affects the conditions of life of the commodity. He has to transform his article into money. The expenses it cost him to maintain it in its commodity form pertain to his own individual experience and do not interest the buyer of the commodity. The latter does not pay him for the circulation time of his commodity. Even if the capitalist deliberately keeps his commodity off the market, in times of a real or anticipated revolution in values, it depends on whether this revolution actually comes about, on the correctness or incorrectness of his speculation, whether he realizes his additional expenses. The revolution in values is not the result of his expenses. Thus, insofar as the formation of a stock is a hold-up in circulation, the expenses occasioned by it add no value to the commodity. On the other hand, there can be no stock without a delay in the circulation sphere, without the capital persisting for a longer or shorter period in its commodity form. Thus, there can be no stock without a hold-up in circulation, just as no money can circulate without the formation of a money reserve. That is to say, without the commodity stock, no commodity circulation. If the capitalist does not encounter this necessity in C' to M', then he encounters it in M to C, not for his own commodity capital, but for the commodity capital of other capitalists, who produce means of production for him and means of subsistence for his workers. Whether the formation of a stock is voluntary or involuntary, i.e., whether the commodity producer deliberately builds a stock, or whether his commodities form a stock as a result of the resistance that the circumstances of the circulation process itself oppose to their sale, makes no essential difference to the matter. Yet it is useful to know, as a contribution towards solving this question, what it is that distinguishes voluntary from involuntary stock formation. The involuntary formation of a stock arises from, or is identical with, a hold-up in circulation that is independent of the knowledge of the commodity producer and goes against his intentions. What characterizes voluntary stock formation? Here, the seller still attempts to get rid of his commodities as fast as possible. He still offers his product for sale as a commodity. If he were to withdraw it from sale, it would form only a potential element of the commodity stock, and not an actual one. The commodity as such is still for him simply the bearer of its exchange value, and as such, it can only have its effect by and through shedding its commodity form and assuming the money form. The commodity stock must have a certain volume in order to satisfy the scale of demand over a given period. The continual extension of the circle of buyers is taken into account in this connection. In order to last for one day, for example, one part of the commodities on the market must persist in the commodity form, while the other part flows and is transformed into money. Of course, the part that stands still in this way steadily declines, as the scale of the stock itself declines until it is finally all sold. This stagnation of commodities is thus taken into account here as a necessary condition for their sale. Moreover, it must be greater in scale than the average sale or the average demand. Otherwise, excesses above this average could not be satisfied. On the other hand, the stock must constantly be renewed, because it is constantly disappearing. In the last instance, this renewal can derive only from production, from a supply of the commodity. It is immaterial whether this comes from abroad or not. The renewal depends on the periods that the commodities need for their reproduction. The stock of commodities must be adequate for this length of time. The fact that this stock does not remain in the hands of the original producers, but runs through various reservoirs from the large-scale merchant to the retail trader, changes only the appearance, and not the thing itself. From the social point of view, a part of the capital still exists in the form of commodity stock, as long as the commodity has not entered into productive or individual consumption. The producer himself attempts to have an inventory adequate for his average demand, in order not to be directly dependent on production and to secure himself a constant circle of customers. The production periods give rise to dates of purchase, and the commodity forms a stock for a longer or shorter period of time before it can be replaced by new items of the same kind. It is only by way of this stock formation that the permanence and continuity of the circulation process is ensured, and hence that of the reproduction process, which includes the circulation process. We must remember that C' to M' can be completed for the producer of C, even though C is still on the market. If the producer himself intended to keep his own commodity in store until it was sold to the final consumer, he would have to set in motion a double capital, once as producer of the commodity, the other time as merchant. As far as the commodity itself is concerned, whether it is considered as an individual commodity or as a component part of the social capital, it makes no difference to the situation whether the expenses of stock formation fall onto its producers or onto a series of merchants from A to Z. Inasmuch as the commodity stock is nothing more than the commodity form of the stock that would still exist on the given scale of social production either as productive stock, latent production fund, or as a consumption fund, reserve of means of consumption, if it did not exist as a commodity stock, the expenses required to maintain the stock, that is, the expenses of stock formation, i.e. the objectified or living labor spent on this, are merely the transposed expenses of maintaining the social production fund and the social consumption fund. The increase in the value of the commodity to which they give rise simply distributes these expenses proportionately between the various commodities, as they are different for different sorts of commodity. The expenses of stock formation continue to be deductions from the social wealth, even though they are a condition of its existence. It is only insofar as the commodity stock is a condition of commodity circulation, and itself a form that has necessarily arisen in commodity circulation, insofar therefore as this apparent stagnation is a form of the flow itself, that it is normal. But once the commodities lingering in their circulation stores fail to make room for the incoming wave of production, and the stores are overfilled, the commodity stock expands as a result of the stagnation of circulation, just as hoards grow if the money circulation stagnates. It is quite immaterial here whether this stagnation takes place in the storerooms of the industrial capitalist or the warehouse of the merchant. The commodity stock is then not a condition of uninterrupted sale, but a consequence of the unsaleability of the commodities. The expenses remain the same. But as they arise purely from the form, i.e. from the necessity of transforming the commodities into money and the difficulty of this metamorphosis, they do not enter into the value of the commodities, but form deductions, a loss of value in the realization of value. Since the normal and the abnormal forms of the stock are not distinguished in their form, and both are stagnations of circulation, the phenomena can be confused and may deceive the agents of production themselves all the more, and that it is possible for the producer to feel that the circulation process of his capital is occurring, that it is in flux, even though the circulation of his commodities, which have passed into the hands of the merchants, is stagnating. If the extent of production increases then, other circumstances remaining the same, so does the volume of the commodity stock. It is then renewed and absorbed just as quickly, but on a greater scale. The rise in the volume of the commodity stock as a result of the stagnation in circulation can thus be mistaken for a symptom of an expansion in the reproduction process, particularly if the real movement is mystified by the development of the credit system. The expenses of stock formation consist of 1. A quantitative reduction in the mass of the product, for example, with stocks of flour. 2. A deterioration in quality. 3. The objectified and living labor required to conserve the stock. Section 3. Transport costs. It is not necessary to go into all the details of the costs of circulation here, such as packing, sorting, etc. The general law is that all circulation costs that arise simply from a change in form of the commodity cannot add any value to it. They are simply costs involved in realizing the value or transferring it from one form into another. The capital expended in these costs, including the labor it commands, belongs to the faux frais of capitalist production. The replacement of these costs must come from the surplus product, and from the standpoint of the capitalist class as a whole, it forms a deduction of surplus value or surplus product, in just the same way as the time that a worker needs to buy his means of subsistence is lost time for him. Transport costs, however, play too important a role not to be briefly considered here. Within the circuit of capital, and the commodity metamorphoses that form a section of it, the metabolism of social labor takes place. This metabolism may require a motion of the products in space, their real movement from one location to another. But circulation of commodities can also take place without their physical movement, as can the transport of products without commodity circulation, even without direct exchange of products. A house that is sold by A to B circulates as a commodity, but it does not get up and walk. Movable commodity values, such as cotton or pig iron, can remain in the same warehouse while they undergo dozens of circulation processes and are bought and resold by speculators. What actually moves here is the property title to the thing and not the thing itself. In the realm of the Incas, on the other hand, the transport industry played a major role, although the social product neither circulated as a commodity nor was distributed by means of exchange. If the transport industry therefore appears as a cause of circulation costs on the basis of capitalist production, this particular form of appearance in no way alters the substance of the matter. The quantity of products is not increased by their transport. The change in their natural properties that may be affected by transport is also, certain exceptions apart, not an intended useful effect, but rather an unavoidable evil. But the use value of things is realized only in their consumption, and their consumption may make a change of location necessary and thus also the additional production process of the transport industry. The productive capital invested in this industry thus adds value to the products transported, partly through the value carried over from the means of transport, partly through the value added by the work of transport. This latter addition of value can be divided, as with all capitalist production, into replacement of wages and surplus value. Within every production process, the change of location of the object of labor and the means of labor and labor power needed for this plays a major role. For instance, cotton that is moved from the carding shop into the spinning shed, coal lifted from the pit to the surface. The transfer of the finished product, as a finished commodity, from one separate place of production to another, a certain distance away, shows the same phenomenon, only on a larger scale. The transport of products from one place of production to another is followed by that of the finished products from the sphere of production to the sphere of consumption. The product is ready for consumption only when it has completed this movement. As we have already seen, it is a general law of commodity production that the productivity of labor and the value it creates stand in inverse proportion. This holds for the transport industry as much as any other. The smaller the quantity of labor, dead and living, that is required to transport a commodity for a given distance, the greater the productive power of the labor, and vice versa. The absolute magnitude of value added by the transport of commodities stands in inverse proportion to the productive power of the transport industry, and in direct proportion to the distance to be covered, other circumstances remaining the same. The relative part of value that transport costs add to the price of the commodity, under otherwise equal circumstances, stands in direct proportion to their size and weight. The modifying circumstances are numerous. Transport requires, for example, greater or lesser measures of precaution, hence more or less expenditure of labor and means of labor according to the relative fragility, perishability, and explosiveness of the article. The railway magnates have shown greater genius in inventing fantastic species than have botanists or zoologists. The classification of goods on the British railways, for example, fills volumes and rests for its general principle on the tendency to transform the variegated natural properties of goods into an equal number of transportation ailments and pretexts for obligatory impositions. Quote, glass, which was formerly worth £11 per crate, is now worth only £2 since the improvements which have taken place in manufactures and since the abolition of the duty. But the rate for carriage is the same as it was formerly, and higher than it was previously when carried by canal. Formerly, manufacturers informed me that they had glass and glasswares for the plumber's trade carried at about 10 shillings per ton, within 50 miles of Birmingham. At the present time, the rate to cover risk of breakage, which we can very rarely get allowed, is 3 times that amount. But the companies always resist any claim that is made for breakages. End quote from the Royal Commission on Railways. Moreover, the fact that the relative share that transport costs add to the value of an article stands in inverse proportion to its value is made by the railway magnates into a special reason for taxing an article in direct proportion to its value. The complaints of the industrialists and merchants on this score are repeated on every page of the evidence in the above quoted report. The capitalist mode of production reduces the transport costs for the individual commodity by developing the means of transport and communication, as well as by concentrating transport, i.e., by increasing its scale. It increases the part of social labor, both living and objectified, that is spent on commodity transport, firstly by transforming the great majority of all products into commodities, and then by replacing local by distant markets. The circulating of commodities, i.e. their actual course in space, can be resolved into the transport of commodities. The transport industry forms on the one hand an independent branch of production, and hence a particular sphere for the investment of productive capital. On the other hand, it is distinguished by its appearance as the continuation of a production process within the circulation process and for the circulation process. End of Part 1.